Hi, I'm Dan Costa, editor-in-chief of PCMag.com, and welcome to Fast Forward, where we have ongoing conversations about living in the future. Today's guest is Dr. Chris Wiggins. He's an associate professor of applied mathematics at Columbia University and the chief data scientist for the New York Times. We're going to talk about the future of media, we're going to talk about algorithmic news feeds, and we're going to talk about how one man can actually have two full-time jobs and still get things done. Chris, thanks so much for stopping by the lab.
Thanks for the invitation.
So I think people are sort of coming around to the idea that every business is in some way a data business.
Yeah.
But when it comes to the New York Times, any website, any digital business, it's just a massive repository for data. So tell me, what do you do? What do you do for the New York Times? What does a day look like?
Yeah, so the first thing that I tell people is that the New York Times still has a strong church-state separation in terms of the org chart. And the church is the people who possess and defend the craft of journalism, and everything else is state, and I'm quite solidly state when it comes to the New York Times. So although I'm chief data scientist, I'm not doing the data journalism, I'm not doing the data interactives and graphics. Yeah. Those are awesome people.
It's probably the first thing anybody asks you. Hey, I love your charts.
Exactly.
And it's like, no, I don't do those charts.
That's right, and I say, those people are awesome, props, I'm not on that team. So it's all things that people are likely not gonna see. So the most important things that the New York Times does every day are the things for which news judgment is relevant, but then there's still a whole lot of things that involve, various ways to stay strong economically, and to understand how people use the product and to try to make sure that that journalism is read by people. As you said, basically any company that has a website has an opportunity to be a data-informed company because all of our digital interactions are really conversations. So every time your iPad looks for data or receives a new message, that's actually a conversation between you and a cacophony of web servers, each of which is recording some amount of that transaction and some metadata about it that allows the company to try to understand how are people actually using my product. So the news, the user experience for news has been a dead tree for several centuries, and now it's become a website or digital in the palm of your hand. And all of those interactions are now an opportunity for any publisher to learn.
And you think about the inputs that went into the media business. You had a circulation, you knew how many people bought your paper. And that was sort of a rough guide of how successful you were going to be. And you could do different types of content, and then eventually you could see how it affected readership. But often it would be months before you would have that information. And even then it was sort of a soft signal. Give people an idea of just how many signals, like in a casual session of reading the paper every day, what kind of data is being transmitted from the user to the New York Times or really any website?
Really, any website, exactly. So,
first, I say this as an operator of a website that does the same thing.
Right, and as I was walking by, I saw a dashboard that was giving every 15-second pings of how many concurrents are happening. So there's an opportunity for any digital property to have a deep understanding of how people are interacting with the content. The first step is that somebody has to want to know those data. So, you can imagine being a circulation publisher and distributing dead trees into single copy stores, but that doesn't mean everybody cares how many copies are being bought. So the first step is for people to want to know that data and to be data curious. But as you said, anyone who visits a website, I encourage you sometime to go to a civilized browser like Chrome, open up the developer tools, and see all of the information that you're sharing. So generally you're giving up your IP address, via a little bit of JavaScript hacks. You're also probably giving up how long you haven't been reading, if you've been idle and you haven't been scrolling, how far a story down you've scrolled, where you're coming from, and then the sort of obvious things like what's your operating system, what device are you using, and of course your IP address is itself a join key in order to all sorts of information about where you are. Once I know your lat long, or I know your zip code even, the zip code is another join key into all sorts of demographic information. This is why we have sort of modern digital data-driven marketing, even outside of platforms like Facebook, where you've also given up a tremendous click data about yourself and what you like. Or if you're using a mobile device, of course, the mobile device knows where you are all the time. When I give talks about this, I show a little graphic from Google Maps that says how many people are in the coffee store at different hours. That's not from doing a survey on people. That's because people are wearing devices that are sensing them all the time. So yes, all of modern life, if you choose to engage in these companies, it's really a data conversation that your devices are happening, whether or not you know about it.
I think it's fascinating, especially location data. People forget that the carriers know where you are all the time, and they need to know in order to deliver service. So they won't share their address. They're very particular about their location with websites, but Once you carry a phone, you're transmitting your location. And if you've got an Android phone anyway, there's probably a lot of apps that'll have access to that information as well.
Yep, yep. So there's really a dynamic relationship between people, technology, and trust. So as you said, people feel like giving their home address is really very personal, but I think it's just a matter of time before people realize how much of their personal identifiable information they're giving away all the time without thinking about possible risks.
So in ingesting, obviously the New York Times knows that it's got this data, it wants to optimize its service, build a better business, and really build a media business that can transition to the digital age. How do you help them do that using data?
So there's a lot of things that we can do to try to understand readers better and also try to produce data-driven products that help the company stay strong and performant. So the very first day I was there, I said we really should build a model that understands which of our subscribers are going to cancel and why. So that's, for a machine learning person, that's a balance between predictive power and interpretability. Predictive power is, can I predict the at-risk individuals? And interpretability is, can I identify the risky behaviors? And that's the kind of information that you can use for tuning your marketing, but also for suggesting product changes. If you realize that there's particular behaviors that are correlated with loyalty, acquisition, retention, then that helps you understand what is it about the digital experience that makes people want to become a New York Times subscriber and to stay a New York Times subscriber. So there's a sort of sector of the problems we work on that are of that ilk of sort of data-driven marketing. There's a whole other sector, though, that's about trying to help advertisers who are interested in advertising on the New York Times to understand who is our audience. So at this point, we have some really beautiful GUIs for understanding who reads what where, not at the level of an individual, but demographically, what are the topics that are over-indexing for Los Angeles relative to Houston, and what are the topics that are over-indexing for, business decision makers or some other group that a marketer might care about relative to other groups. That's an abundance of data that we know, and now we can share it with marketers who are interested in advertising at the New York Times.
So in terms of, do you have any examples, like how would you know that somebody was likely to cancel? Understanding you don't want to give any trade secrets away, but like what kind of behavior would you be able to identify?
Sure. So I mean, the behavior there's a couple of behaviors that are correlated with acquisition, retention, and loyalty. One is breadth of exploration. Generally, people who choose to become a subscriber and remain a subscriber are curious, and they're interested in not just reading one section, but you can see in the data many ways of correlating the fact that somebody reads broadly with the fact that they're more likely to become and to remain a New York Times subscriber. And the other is just regularity of engagement, that people for whom the New York Times is not a habit are less likely to remain a subscriber. And so that's influenced a lot of our I would say the newsroom as well as on the business side, thinking about what it means for the New York Times to be part of somebody's habit.
In terms of the media industry, the companies that have really sort of excelled in the last 10 years, Facebook and Google, are taking up massive amounts of media spend, and they're doing it in part because of their data advantage. They have so much more data than all these individual sites. Like, what's the solution for media providers? Can they compete with these giants on a data basis, or do they have to find another way to do it?
I think there's a lot of strategies that are available. I mean, if you're going to stay in digital advertising, then you have to either convince people that the metrics that Facebook and Google are supplying are not the metrics that you really should care about as a marketer, which is more true for brand advertising than transactional advertising. And Facebook helps with that every now and then when they say, oops, we accidentally doubled the number of viewable minutes in our videos or something like that. But the other way that many media properties are responding is by moving away from advertising. And I think the New York Times is an example. The crossover between advertising and subscription was several years ago. And at this point, the New York Times thinks of its future as a business as being about a digital subscription service, at least as much as it is about an advertising model, which of course upends the income model of journalism for the last several centuries.
There seems like there's a couple of different waves in media and digital media. The first wave was all about page views and eyeballs and clicks, and that led to all sorts of distortions in the media landscape. And then the second wave was all about engagement and time on page and volatility, and that led to its own issues, largely around Facebook's algorithm, which was optimizing for that engagement. What comes next? Is there another metric that we're going to work against that we're going to measure ourselves and be able to build a business around?
Yeah, so part of that is a really interesting arms race around what you can build and what you can track, and then convincing people that you should be charging them for that. So for example, with a couple of JavaScript hacks, you can keep track of somebody's time on page, right? So then it's in the business of interest of everybody who tracks that to charge for that rather than track for clicks, right? Clicks, as everyone knows, are things that are easy to count, but it's not clear that clicks are what counts. So really, you see this interesting technology arms race where people realize that you can track something, you can use some other engagement metric as the true definition of engagement, and then there's a business need. Can you convince people that that's the metric they should be using to charge people? Part of the dynamics, I think, is going to be people rethinking the ad model in general, advertisers as well as users. But part of it is, I'm sure, going to continue to be an arms race in which people realize that there are other ways to track engagement. And again, thinking about things like brand advertising, it's not clear that clicks are exactly the thing that really counts. It's easy to count, but it's not clear that that's really what counts for you when you're a brand marketer.
It seems to me that there's a battle going on. The media landscape's being defined. You've got these giant tech companies that are collecting all of this data. You've got media companies also collecting data and trying to use that data in order to target users and readers and basically sell them to advertisers. Advertisers have access to a lot of data. In this landscape, I feel like the average user doesn't have control of their data and doesn't really understand how all of these things are connected. Do you worry that there's like the data haves and the data have nots, and we're sort of separating out on a power basis here?
So the data haves and the data have nots, you mean refer to companies then?
Companies and also all the way down to the individual level. Like, individuals don't have a good sense of what their data is worth, how it's being used, or how it's being trafficked. There's been a little bit of a light that's been shined on it, but I still don't think people understand what their own data is worth, and they ultimately don't have a lot of control about how it's being used.
Absolutely. So in terms of what's happening for companies, you're absolutely right that there's the possibility for a sort of a vicious cycle where the companies that have the most data and know how to monetize those data will own more market share and therefore get more data. So there's certainly the possibility that the rich will get richer when it comes to having more data and therefore profiting from more data, capturing more of that fraction. For the individuals, you're absolutely right that individuals by and large have not cared about their data being given up in exchange for free services, free documents, free email in exchange for, as Eben Moglen puts it, free spying on you all the time. This was a talk by Eben Moglen called Privacy in the Cloud in 2010.
Still true today.
It's still true today.
Even more so.
Quite prescient, yeah. So, people in general don't seem to care about these things. Privacy breaches like the recent Facebook one are just one in a long list of exposed bad behavior by Facebook, which seems to hurt their stock price for about 48 hours. And then people are more than happy to go back to the platform. It's kind of amazing. But I think with any technology, there's a long time period between when the technology is introduced and when people learn to use that technology responsibly. For example, people started mass-producing cars in 1916. Meaningful legislation around seatbelts didn't happen until like the 60s. And in one state, you still don't have to wear a seatbelt. So if you think about that sort of visible graphic type of consumer damage relative to privacy breaches or your data getting sold or filter bubbles or other things that are invisible and stochastic. You can't see them and it's sort of probabilistic whether you get the hit. It's unclear when consumers will demand that sort of consumer protection when it comes to their own data.
Do you think consumers have to obviously consumers have to demand it before there could be any kind of legal solution? But they're working on it in the EU.
That's
We
right.
just finished our GDPR compliance, like every other website on the web. Was a pretty onerous process.
Yep.
Do you think is that a path that we should then pursue in the United States, globally? Like, do you think GDPR is going to be effective?
I think we have many weapons at our disposal. So, if you think about, as Bill Janeway says, there's a sort of a three-party game among the individuals in the market forces, and the government. There's room for all those players in the unstable game. So the government has a role in terms of legislation, regulation. People in the market have a role in terms of starving these companies of finite resources. That includes money, their data, engineering talent, and private companies have an ARB, sort of an exploit that they can take on by, for example, billing themselves as, Facebook but with privacy, or Google search but with privacy. There's plenty of web browsers and web searches that's their value add. So I don't think it's just about GDPR. That's just one, government legislation is just one of, or government regulation rather, is just one of several things that are at our disposal. Litigation and education are all sort of other weapons that are at our disposal, and if consumers decide that's important, there are many weapons at their disposal. Also remember that government can happen at many scales, right? There's federal regulation, but there's also state and local regulation and international regulation. As you're pointing out, for an international company like Facebook, doing something in the EU matters. These are not companies that are simply going to say, we're just not going to have any service in those companies.
Yeah. You talked about education, and you of course have another job. You are associate professor at Columbia,
Yep.
and there you're working more on the church side than on the state side, presumably.
Yeah, yeah, that's right.
But you're trying to do you've got a new curriculum that involves a lot of these topics: data and ethics, most importantly, and history.
Yep.
Can you talk a little bit about that curriculum?
Sure. So this is a class I co-developed with an actual history professor, Matt Jones. I'm a history fan, but he's a professional historian, and we co-developed this class about the history and ethics of data. So we're trying to look at the sort of modern world in which data-informed algorithms are mediating all of our realities in the palm of our hand all the time. And they shape how we think about things in terms of politics and personal lives and everything else. So the question we sort of ask retrospectively is, how did we get here? So we start out in 1770 with the first usage of the word statistics, and we sort of draw out, all the various ways that people have tried to organize statecraft using data, and then make sense of science using data, and then decide what is true using data. And then there's a major breakpoint in World War II when digital computation happens. And that really gives rise to an incredible industrial use of data, which culminates in, as Zeynep Tufekci calls it, the persuasion architectures. So the way in which our reality is constantly being jammed by algorithms now. You can really draw out the historical threads that got us here on the algorithm side, on the business side, and also in terms of society, how we all are okay with that happening to us.
And I think, so do you think data science is something that should be part of every curriculum? I mean, there was a time when everybody needed to learn how to program. Computer science was going to be, everybody needed to take at least a computer course because that was the future.
Yeah.
Is data that integral to our digital future?
So yes and no. So I would say that data has become a lot like what computation was, 15 years ago, that there was an idea that everybody should have some computational capabilities. The no part of it is, I think people realized 10 years ago that having computational capabilities doesn't necessarily mean that everybody should learn to code, but everybody is going to be able to use computation to tell a story. That's sort of a rhetorical capability. And everyone is going to be subjected to computers making arguments for what's true and what's real. And so everybody has the opportunity to learn some critical facility around computation. So I would say exactly the same thing around data capabilities today. So those sort of multi-capabilities are some people who know how to code with data and make sense of the world through data computationally, some people who are really good at knowing how those data analyses have import and carry a story. That's sort of a rhetorical capability. And all of us are going to need to develop a lot of critical capability, because when somebody comes at you with data, and that's going to be happening more and more, not just in data journalism, but in general, like when an algorithm tells you this is really what you're searching for, all of us need to have the critical capability to understand the subjective design choices that went into that algorithm and ways in which it is and is not in our best interest.
Yeah. All data is not correct, and certainly not created equal.
Not only that, but all data, I like the word data because it comes from this word to give. So it's like the thing becomes data at the moment that somebody gave it to you and you say, look, I'm not going to take responsibility for it beyond this point. Somebody just gave it to me, right? So it sort of loses its aspect of data when you're willing to critique, well, where did that data come from? How did you get it? What was the process that generated that data?
So I want to take a personal note here and talk about your personal data management habits. You've got an iPhone 10 sitting on the table next to you. You've also got a pen and paper,
Amen.
Which I've seen you use multiple times. How do you manage your own data flow, and how do you manage to be productive enough to carry two jobs?
Yeah. So carrying the productivity thing, I think, is a little bit of people, process, and technology. Like in terms of technology, I love the Unix operating system, and I spend all my time at the command line. I try to minimize the time that I spend pointing and clicking. So if I can do something at the command line, searching, writing emails, managing information generally, I try to do that. In terms of process, a lot of it I think is very rigorous information diet management. So I've never done Facebook, and I signed off of Twitter after the election when it just sort of became a raging dumpster fire. And just being rigorous about information diet, I think, is part of maintaining productivity. And in terms of people, I'm fortunate to work with or have hired very good collaborators. So I work with a lot of people who I think are very good at what they do and don't require a lot of micromanagement from me. Like my group at the NYTimes is full of people who I think are really good at getting things done. And similarly at Columbia, I work with a bunch of postdocs and graduate students who I think are very good at being productive without me needing to direct everything.
I think that's solid advice, although I'm not sure I'm going to be able to learn Unix anytime soon.
I recommend.
It's been recommended to me before. Yeah. I want to get to my closing questions.
Sure.
Is there a technological trend that concerns you and that keeps you up at night?
Persuasion architectures. So generally the way that our view of reality is mediated by people who are interested in monetizing our attention. I mean, this has been true since the 70s, if not earlier, but the fact that it's done in such an incredibly highly optimized and personalized way is really of concern. And it seems to be just jamming everyone's reality in a way that's, I think, not in everyone's best long-term interest.
I mean, I think, it's the stat came out that campaigns are able to create 200, 300,000 different political ads, release them all on one day, and then have them compete to be the most effective ad for individual micro audiences. Mm-hmm. We've just never had that capability before.
Correct. If you think about the phrase, you can't fool everybody all the time now, because you can say basically different things to everybody. You really could fool everybody in a different way.
One at a time.
Right, one at a time.
Yeah.
Right.
Is there a technology every day that inspires wonder?
Unix. And I just use Unix all the time, and I just think it was built by ancient wizards from the 70s. Just makes everything better.
And will be here forever? You're not worried about eventually it falling out of favor, falling out of use?
Compared to other technologies, it's been sticking around. I mean, it's almost as old as I am. So, every now and then a graduate student will show me some new fancy thing or some new Chrome bookmarklet thingy, and I'm like, no, I'm going to stick with Unix. I think Unix is going to be here for longer than that.
Fair enough. So you're not on Twitter, you're not on Facebook. How can people find you online, follow what you're doing?
Well, I split my time among sort of a .com, a .org, and a .edu. So in terms of things that I do with Hack NY, which is a startup that a nonprofit that I co-founded, you can follow them on Twitter, Hack NY. In terms of Columbia, I teach, and everything that I do in the data class is on the GitHub. So if you want to follow along the GitHub repo for that class, we update that as we lecture. And other than that, just come be my friend. I don't know. I don't spend a lot of time on the socials these days.
I understand.
Basically,
why.
after the election, I moved from all my online activity to a bunch of private Slacks. So if you know me, you're probably in a Slack, one of several Slack channels with me at this point.
Yep. So more balkanization of the media industry.
That's where we're at in 2018. I'm not sure if it'll remain that way, but for 2018, that's where we're at.
This was a great talk. Thanks so much for coming
Sure.
by. I
My
appreciate
pleasure.
it. That's Fast Forward for today. If you want to see past episodes, you can find them on PCMag.com or wherever fine podcasts are given away for free. Thanks so much for joining us. I'll see you in the future.